Okay, in this video I'm going to give an introduction to factoring trinomials. Now, in this class we're going to be able to factor, or you should be able to recognize, 4 different types of trinomial factoring. Okay, and I'm just going to list them here immediately, and then I'll give a quick example on each, and then I'll provide other videos that will explain them a little bit more in depth, okay? But let's talk a little bit about what a trinomial is. Well, the word tri means 3, right? So trinomials are basically 3 terms that are separated by additions and subtractions. So 3 terms that are separated by additions and or subtractions. Okay? Now, what would be an example of a trinomial? Well, an obvious one might be something like this. X squared minus 7x plus 10. And again, let's just go ahead and identify that. This is a term that is separated from the next term by a subtraction, so that would be one term. There's a subtraction. This would be another term. There's an addition, and here's a third term. So 3 terms separated by either any combination of additions and or subtractions. And that's actually the definition of a polynomial. It's just any number of terms that are separated by additions and or subtractions. Now we're going to be dealing specifically with trinomials that are called quadratic trinomials. Now what does that mean? Alright, let me just write that in there real quickly. Quadratic trinomials actually have specific characteristics, right? And they will always have a leading term that is some type of a square. Okay? So, one characteristic, leading term, which means just the first term, right? The leading term, which is a square of some kind. That could be x to the 2nd, x to the 4th, x to the 6th, okay? And so that leading term is called the quadratic term, because that's what defines the quadratic trinomial. Now the middle term, the term that has a degree of 1, remember what degree means? This means a degree of 2, this means a degree of 1. This middle term is called a linear term. Why is it called a linear term? Well, if you were to actually graph this, you would get basically a straight line of some kind. So that's why they call them linear terms. If you were to graph a quadratic term, you're going to get a parabola of some kind. We'll talk about that in a little bit later. And then finally, the last term, the term that does not have a variable, that's called the constant term. Okay? So, we're going to be dealing with factoring quadratic trinomials, all right, specifically. Okay, let's go back to our initial quadratic trinomial, x squared minus 7x plus 10. And the first question, now we're going to start talking about how to recognize the 4 types of polynomials, or trinomials rather, that I want you to be able to factor. The 4 types are, the first question being, are any factors common? Are any factors, let me just get rid of that, common for each term? For example, like you'll notice that in the first term and the second term, what's common there is an x, right? But there's no x in the third term. That's really about it in terms of even commonality. But if there is a common factor, you go ahead and factor it out. Let me give you a short example on this side over here. So something like, let's just double everything up. 2x squared minus 14x plus 20. Now, if I were to look at that trinomial and say, are there any common factors for each of the terms? And the answer would be 2, wouldn't it? So you'd factor out the 2, and then go ahead and rewrite the trinomial, and you'd have 2 times x squared, we get 2x squared. 2 times negative 7x, you get negative 14x. 2 times positive 10, you get positive 20. So we just factored out a 2. All right. So that's always the first question that you ask. Second question, is the leading term, or actually I should say does, D-O-E, does the leading term have a coefficient of 1? Now, again, let's look at this particular leading term. Notice that there is no number in front of the x squared. The number in front of the variable is actually called the coefficient. And here the answer is yes, it does have a leading coefficient of 1. Now that's going to let me go through a different series to factor this particular trinomial. So the way you do that, real quickly, is by looking at the last term and asking yourself, are there any factors of 10 that add up to negative 7? And the answer is yes, negative 2 and negative 5. Okay? All right, so negative 2 and negative 5. So when you multiply these two numbers, you get positive 10. When you add these two factors, you get negative 7. And then you take the square root of the leading term, x and x, and there's your answer. Okay? So x times x, just to do a quick check, x times x is x squared, x times negative 2, negative 5 times x, and negative 5 times negative 2. Add those all up, you get x squared minus 7x plus 10. So you've successfully factored this. So again, if the leading term has a coefficient of 1, you go immediately to the constant term and then go ahead and see if there's any factors that add up to the middle term. Okay? Now the third question that you want to ask is, does the leading term have a coefficient of something other than 1? And if it does, you're going to use a technique called the bottoms up. Okay. Now, some teachers don't like to use the bottoms up because they don't think it's mathematically sound. Actually, it is. But I'm going to show you that in a different video because it's a rather long process. But you just look for a leading coefficient that's other than 1. So for example, something like 3x squared plus, let's say 10x minus, let's go with 6. Okay? That would be an example of a leading term that has a number other than 1 for a leading coefficient. And finally, the last type of trinomial that I want you to recognize is what they call a perfect square trinomial. So is the trinomial a perfect square trinomial? Now, an example of a perfect square trinomial is something like this: x squared plus 4x plus 4. And for a perfect square trinomial, you need to have a perfect square for the leading term, and you need to have a perfect square for the constant term. Okay? So those are the 4 questions. All right, make sure you ask them in this order. Are the factors common? Are there any? And if they are, you have to take them out. Then you just go right through these. Is the coefficient 1? Is it something other than 1? Or is a trinomial a perfect square trinomial? Okay, I hope that was helpful.